morning again, everyone. So I'll be presenting 3 studies during my presentation. But I think the most important thing is I'd like to echo something that Professor Gibney stated in his talk. And it's one of the things I will echo is that he stated that a good breakfast does not necessarily translate in a good diet overall. So that's one of several messages I'd like to get across with my presentations. So my first presentation will focus on breakfast skipping and weight and move on to this whole concept of breakfast patterns, followed by a clinical study a very rigorous clinical study looking at breakfast and cognition. Once again, I'd like to give you a few of my disclosures. If I gave you all of my disclosures, it probably would be close to 8 to 10 slides. So I was just being a little modest here. So just to summarize some of the literature for breakfast and nutrient intake, for kids, breakfast supplies less than 20% of calories, 30% of calcium, iron, and the B vitamins. Breakfast eaters tend to consume less cholesterol, less fat, and more fiber. And the nutrients missed at breakfast, namely calcium, fiber, and certain vitamins and minerals, are not made up during the day. And finally, cereal eaters have highest mean adequacy ratio for micronutrients. If you look at breakfast and weight, the USDA Nutrition Evidence Library summarized the literature looking at 15 studies from the US, UK, Mexico, and Norway, and it was a combination of randomized controlled trials and also prospective cohort studies. And what they found was that most studies found an inverse relationship between breakfast eating and body weight in both children and adult populations. A point that I will make now and also reinforce later is that we don't know if there's any reverse causality that's going on with regard to this relationship. I mean, is people who are overweight trying to skip breakfast so that they can decrease their body weight. So the first study, which was published in 2010, is looking at the relationship of breakfast skipping and the type of breakfast consumed with nutrient intake and weight status in children and adolescents. With a little background information, national data comparing nutrient intakes and anthropometric measures in children and adolescents in the United States who skip breakfast or consume different types of breakfast are limited. And so the objective of this study was to examine the relationship between breakfast skipping and the type of breakfast consumed with nutrient intake, nutrient adequacy, and adiposity status. Now, the type of breakfast that we looked at was ready-to-eat cereal, and then another group called other breakfast, which was a combination of other different types of breakfast. So if you look at the demographics of the population, you can see that roughly there was 32% between the ages of 14 to 18 years of age and 20% between 9 to 13 years of age. And if you look at the total for the ready-to-eat cereal, those were breakfast skippers, by the way. That's what BS is in that column. You can see that the demographic breakdown by age group was quite similar for the ready-to-eat cereal and also for the other breakfast consumers. So there was an equal distribution of the age groups across the 3 different breakfast groups. So the methods that we use, we have what you call the mean adequacy ratio, and this involves the adequacy for 5 shortfall nutrients, which include vitamin E, calcium, magnesium, potassium, and dietary fiber. And then 13 micronutrients were calculated as the percent of the age, gender specific RDA or AI, and I can hear Professor Gibney over there saying we should have went with the EAR, but at the time we went with the RDA because of the time of the study. a conservative score of 90 was considered nutritionally adequate for the mean adequacy ratio. So over to the left is the 13 micronutrients combined, and then you have the 5 shortfall nutrients, and then you have your 3 breakfast groups. The first one is breakfast skipping, followed by the ready-to-eat consumers, and then the other breakfast consumers. And then the mean adequacy ratio was scored for the 3 different groups. And you can see that the mean adequacy ratio was higher for the other breakfast consumers compared to the skippers. And you can see that the ready-to-eat consumers also had a higher mean adequacy ratio than the breakfast skippers, not only for the 13 micronutrients, but also for the 5 shortfall nutrients that we studied in the study. Now, if you look at the BMI Z-scores, which is the appropriate measure that we use for children and adolescents, and once again, if you look at the mean Z-scores for BMI for age, you can see that the mean BMI Z-scores is significantly lower for the ready-to-eat cereal consumers compared to the skippers, and also the other breakfast consumers had lower BMI Z-scores compared to the breakfast skippers. So, in summary for this slide, you have 20% of children and 32% of adolescents that skip breakfast. However, it's important to keep in mind that the percent consuming breakfast will vary a little with variation in survey duration. Also, the breakfast skippers had the lowest mean adequacy ratio for micronutrients compared to those who consume breakfast. And breakfast skippers also the highest body mass index compared to those that consume some type of breakfast. Okay, the second study, I'm going to go a little bit slower because I really want you to get this concept of breakfast patterns. So nutrient intake, diet quality, and weight measures in breakfast patterns consumed by children compared with breakfast skippers. So most studies showing that children consuming breakfast have better nutrient intakes, diet quality, and lower weight than breakfast skippers. But this is based on the incorrect premise that breakfast meals are homogeneous. So basically, they'll look at consumers versus non-consumers, regardless of the breakfast type, and then look at nutrient intakes, diet quality, and weight status. But you see from my presentation that by looking at breakfast patterns, the nutrient profile will vary considerably across the patterns, and that the effect that it has on weight status will also vary considerably across the breakfast patterns. So the objective of this study was to identify breakfast consumption patterns as they relate to nutrient intake, diet quality, and weight in children. Okay, this is a very busy slide. So I'm not going to try to explain to you what I mean by percent of breakfast energy at the centroid of the pattern. That's beyond my 40-minute lecture. But just look at the numbers. It basically gives you the numbers within the patterns. And so let me give you an example. I didn't do all the 12. We came up with 12 distinct breakfast patterns. And how did we do this? Well, there's a computer program, and the computer does it for you. There are other ways in which people look at patterns. They do it a priori, where they can come up with their own patterns and force people into those patterns. But for purposes of my presentation, this is computer generated by a specific program. So let's take the first group as an example. So you got GR, LFM, sweets, and FJ. What does that all mean? Okay, that means that the N within this breakfast pattern 1, which represented 22% of the population, and the number was around 2,800 kids. And if you look at the highest numbers across the food groups up top, you can see that you got low-fat milk, you've got grains that shows up, and then you got fruit juices. And then if you take it one step further over, which I didn't circle, it was a 10, that becomes sweets. And so as a researcher, you look at these foods and you come up with a name and identify that pattern by the results within that group. So we called it the grain, low-fat milk, sweets, and fruit juice pattern. Let's do another one just as an example. So we got here PSR Tech, and we've got LFM. LFM, low-fat milk, and you've got pre-sweetened, ready-to-eat cereals. If you look across the numbers, you've got 34 under low-fat milk, and then you have 58 under PSR Tech, pre-sweetened, ready-to-eat cereals. Are you all following me? Okay, so taking those two results, giving it a name, we called it PSR Tech LFM. One more, well, probably two more. So we have grain, which constituted about 8% of the population. And if you look way across, the only thing that stands out is that number 88. Everything is either a 2 or a 2114. And so that pattern is clearly called grain breakfast pattern. Let's look at the next one. So we have PSR Tech. We've already identified what that is. That's pre-sweetened, ready-to-eat cereal. And then you've got WM, which is whole milk. So you see the two circles. You got 39 for whole milk, and you got 55 for the pre-sweetened, ready-to-eat cereals. And that one breakfast pattern constituted about 7% of the population. So once again, these are just three examples that I wanted you just to understand how the computer creates these 12 distinct breakfast patterns. And you could do this with other meal periods. We have several papers that we published on snacking. Everybody assumes that snacks are homogeneous as well, but it's not. I'm sure the snack you had yesterday is not the same snack that I had. And so that's the beauty of doing this pattern analysis, because you get to identify different patterns within different meals. So let's look at just, basically I want you to look at the variation within the different patterns. Okay, so this is only breakfast consumption only, and then I will then slowly segue into total daily intake. Once again, emphasizing what Professor Gidney said, and you'll see it clearly that a good breakfast does not translate into a good overall diet. So here, if you look at the energy composition of the 12 breakfast patterns down the side, I'm trying to see if there's any ones that you can't figure out. Eggs, grain, MPF, that's 1, 2, 3. The fifth pattern, MPF, is meat, poultry, and fish. We did FJ, that's fruit juice, and I think the rest is self-explanatory. But if we look at energy intake across the 12 patterns, the energy intake can range from 318 kcals up to 783, depending upon the pattern. Protein, 8.5 grams all the way up to 25 grams of protein, depending upon the pattern. Added sugars, 2.0 teaspoons, and then as high as 6 teaspoons. And sodium, this is remarkable. I mean, it ranges from 339 milligrams up to around 1,100 milligrams of sodium. Saturated fat, the range was from 3.1 grams of saturated fat to 9.5 grams of saturated fat. Solid fat ranged from 4.9 to 20.1 grams. And cholesterol ranged from 22 grams up to 421. And then finally, we looked at what we call, these are nutrients of public health concern. What does that mean? According to the dietary guidelines, these are nutrients that are underconsumed to the point that they could have adverse health effects. And so if you look at dietary fiber, ranges from 1.5 to 4.6. Vitamin D from 0.4 to 4.4 micrograms. Calcium, 127 milligrams up to 412 milligrams of calcium. And then potassium, around 211 milligrams up to 245 milligrams of potassium, depending upon the pattern. And then finally, we have shortfall nutrients. These are also nutrients that are underconsumed, and they include vitamin A, and the patterns range from 97 micrograms to 406 micrograms. Vitamin C range from 7 milligrams up to 41 milligrams. And then as far as folate, you have 99.5 micrograms up to 431 micrograms. Iron range from 2.6 milligrams up to 8.5 milligrams. And as far as magnesium, it ranged from 28 milligrams to as high as 85 milligrams. So let's now focus on total nutrient intake. And if you compare, which I don't have a slide to show you, if I compare the ranges with the breakfast composition to its contribution to total daily consumption, you can see that it's not consistent. Just because it's low in iron, when we look at the breakfast meal only, it doesn't mean that it's the lowest in iron when you look at total day. So for total daily consumption, the range for dietary fiber was from 11 grams to about 16 grams. For vitamin D, it was from 3.3 micrograms up to 8.1. Calcium, that's a big spread, about 813 milligrams up to 1,200 milligrams. And then potassium ranges from about 1870 micrograms to 2540. So let's focus on vitamin A. The range was 395 micrograms up to 843. Vitamin C range was from 71 milligrams up to 109 milligrams. Folate ranged from roughly 400 micrograms up to 769. Iron ranged from 12.4 milligrams up to 18.7. And magnesium ranged from 202 up to 276 milligrams. Once again, a lot of variation, not only in the breakfast meal, but also what they're eating throughout the day. So it's important to make note here, and I'm going to show it as a limitation, is you got no breakfast consumers. So what's being reflected in total daily consumption is what is being consumed outside of having no breakfast. So a caveat to my conclusions to the study is just because the grain breakfast pattern, let's say, has the lowest vitamin C content of the total day, it does not necessarily reflect the grain pattern per se. We also have to look at what is being consumed throughout the 24-hour period. And that would be an extension of the study. You know, what other food groups are they consuming beyond the breakfast meal to account for some of these variations in nutrient intake. In order to measure diet quality, we measure this by looking at the Healthy Eating Index, which is developed by USDA. And basically, the Healthy Eating Index is it tries to mirror the dietary recommendations that are set forth at that time period. Once again, you can see there are 6 patterns that have a higher diet quality compared to no breakfast, as indicated in the red circles. Okay, let's look at weight parameters by children by breakfast pattern. Here, you can see that 5 of the breakfast patterns have significantly lower BMI Z-scores compared to the breakfast skippers, or no pattern per se. And these included the first one, which is grains, low-fat milk, sweets, and fruit juice, followed by pre-sweetened, ready-to-eat cereals and whole milk, followed by soft drinks, fruit juice, grains, and potatoes, ready-to-eat cereal and whole milk, and then finally cooked cereal, milk, and fruit juice. So weight was not consistently associated with breakfast because it did vary depending upon the pattern of breakfast that was identified. So in conclusion, results suggest that simply consuming breakfast was not associated with better diet quality when compared to breakfast skippers. The specific foods and food groups consumed at the breakfast meal may have influenced overall diet quality. However, other foods consumed throughout the day may have influenced the results. That's a very important conclusion and possibly a limitation of the study. So I often ask myself, if breakfast is the most important meal of the day, why doesn't it come with a cocktail and dessert? Okay, let's move on to my last study. So I'll ask you, did you have breakfast this morning? Raise your hand. How many had breakfast this morning? Okay. Is it because it helps you focus so you can learn and get smarter? Raise your hand. Is that true? Is that true? I don't see any hands. Boy, I guess I can go home now. And then false. Okay, well, now we'll move on to my final study. It's looking at breakfast consumption and whether or not it has an effect on neuropsychological functioning in children. It was a repeated measure clinical trial. So a little background. Typically in a 24-hour day, the longest period that children go without food is from the beginning of sleep at night to the first meal of the following day. Therefore, the morning suggests an ideal time to examine the effects of fasting on basic processes that underpin learning and behavior. Several systematic reviews of published studies have examined the relationship between breakfast consumption and breakfast skipping during childhood and its impact on cognitive and academic performance and psychological processes. Breakfast consumption has been positively associated with vigilance, attention, arithmetic, problem-solving tasks, and logical reasoning. Has been negatively associated with problem-solving, short-term memory, attention, and episodic memory. So what limits our ability to draw conclusions? Because the findings are inconsistent across the studies. The heterogeneity among the studies with regard to the types and the composition of the meals varies considerably across the studies. The behavioral and cognitive processes that were examined varies considerably. A lot of the earlier studies by Pollitt, who worked down in Central America for the most part, a lot of people looking at school performance and attendance, which is quite different than the measures that we use. The measures we use are clinically acceptable measures with standardized protocols that they used in child developmental psychology. Also, it's important to look at single meal versus habitual breakfast consumption. And once again, there's variations in socioeconomic status and nutritional status of the study subjects. And as you will see from our study, we tried to get the healthiest of the healthiest kids. I mean, we had to contact 2,400 children in order to get our final sample of 128 because of our exclusionary criteria. I'd say at least 80% of the kids in Houston have ADHD, and that was one of our exclusionary criteria. So the objective of the study was designed to address inconsistencies observed in previous studies by examining healthy, low and middle income school-aged children, and thus the objective of the study was to determine the short-term effects, very important, short-term effects of breakfast consumption and fasting on neuropsychological functioning using a robust set of psychological measures of multiple domains of cognitive functioning. So what was the eligibility? African American, Hispanic American, and Caucasian male and female children ages 8 to 10 years. And they needed to be low and middle income. Low SES children were defined as those who receive free or reduced free lunches, and middle income children were defined as those not on a free reduced school lunches with a family income less than $125,000 per year. So let's look at the study design. We used the crossover clinical trial, which was a repeated measure design in which each subject was randomly assigned to complete 3 different breakfast conditions in one of 6 possible orders. Participants completed the 3 conditions separated by a minimum of 6 days. So each child was studied alone and received the 3 breakfast conditions, which were systematically sequenced or counterbalanced across all 3 scheduled visits. The 3 breakfast conditions were no breakfast, which is the fasting state, breakfast composed of bread and hazelnut spread, milk and apple slices, or 3 breakfast composed of waffles and syrup, milk, and apple slices. The breakfast foods were chosen because of their popularity among children and to be consistent with current recommendations for foods and nutrients in school breakfast meals. I'm trying to go down. Okay, and it's important to keep in mind that the 2 different breakfast entrees were chosen in an effort to examine whether the outcomes could be generalized rather than related to a specific food, and we did not look at variations in macronutrient content. Sample size. So a sample size of 154 children with an anticipated 20% dropout rate was designed to detect an effect size of 1.5 units. Important to note, this was an arbitrary effect size, given that we had several outcome measures and we didn't know which one to pick in order to determine our effect size. So that is a limitation of the study, was using an arbitrary effect size. So as far as the diets of the children were controlled on the day before the breakfast intervention by omitting all children 15 hours before the morning experimental procedures began. Children consumed a dinner meal with either a chicken nugget entree and other foods, or with a macaroni and cheese entree and other foods. Important to note that both dinners were similar in energy content and macronutrient composition. After the dinner meal, children were required not to drink or eat any other foods or beverages except for water. And the next morning, children received one of the 3 breakfast intervention treatments. The waffle breakfast and the hazelnut breakfast both had similar energy content and macronutrient composition, and the macronutrient composition is similar to the macronutrient composition of the U.S. population for children as a whole. So what was the intent of the study? The study focused on the short-term, generalized effects of breakfast consumption on cognitive functioning without being related to a specific food. So the dinner meal and the breakfast meal each separately provided about 1/3 and 1/4, respectively, of the recommended energy and macronutrient levels for children aged to 8 to 10 years. Children were observed during mealtime by the research study coordinator and were required to finish all foods and beverages. At least 80% of the foods by weight had to be consumed in order to remain in the study. Believe me, it was a challenge to get these kids to reach our goal of 80% of consuming that breakfast meal. The intent of the study was not to look at the impact of variations in macronutrient composition of breakfast meals on neuropsychological functioning. So briefly, our evening procedures: a history and physical exam was conducted by a physician to screen for general health and conditions that may affect participation status and performance during testing. Children arrived in the early evening for their initial visit to be further screened for final exclusion criteria and to complete written informed consent procedures. So it's important, we excluded kids during the 2 screening levels. We had 2 screening levels prior to coming into our metabolic unit. And then once they had the evening procedures, we excluded some more based on some other findings. And then even on the next day, we excluded more because if the hemoglobin wasn't in a certain level, or if their glucose was too low or way too high, they were further excluded. So exclusion happened throughout many phases of the study. We also asked each child to taste the hazelnut spread to determine if he or she was willing to consume this food, an entree for one of the breakfasts. If the child was unwilling to consume it, he or she was excluded from the study. The physician also assessed puberty status by Tanner staging. Okay, let's look at the experimental protocol for the morning procedures. So the waking up. The fixed order was used to reduce noise. Well, we'll do that next. So on average, it took 1 hour of testing for each participant. Pre and post breakfast blood testing for glucose and ketones was performed. The study terminated if the child's glucose concentration was less than 69 milligrams per deciliter. At 8:30, the children were served the breakfast assigned that morning, or they continued to fast if they were in the breakfast skipping treatment arm. And at 10:30, a trained neuropsychological evaluator, blinded to the subject's breakfast condition, administered a battery of 4 tests. But among those 4 tests, there were 13 subscales that were assessed, or domains, on each subject. This was in The neuropsychological tests were administered in fixed order, separated by a minimum of 6 days. The fixed order was used to minimize any noise due to variable performance with multiple combinations and to help control sequencing and practice effects among multiple evaluators. Okay, this is the sample demographics. The sample, the mean age was around 9.23 years. You can see that it was half split between males and females, 48 versus 52%. The highest percentage was, mine slide looks different. So you have roughly 31% that were Hispanic American, 38% African American, 28% white. White was the ethnic and race breakdown of the sample. And you can see that 50% of the reported a household annual income of less than $50,000 a year. The ethnic breakdown is very similar to the ethnic breakdown of Houston as a whole. Roughly 69% of the mothers were married, and 52% had some college or less education. 66% of the children reported always consuming breakfast. That's an important point. However, we only asked one question. How often do you consume breakfast? Always, sometimes, or never. As you all know, there is a limitation of using one question to measure a construct, but we did need to provide that in the assessment. We also had to find out whether or not they slept well the night before in the metabolic unit. It was a strange place. It looked like a hotel, but we had to assess whether or not they had a good night's sleep prior to neuropsychological testing. And so you can see here, 97% said that they had good to very good sleep last night. Okay, over to the left are the global measures that are typically used in clinical practice. And in the middle, you have your subtest, and you can see that there are 13 different subscales that we assessed. But the important point is that when we compared the 2 breakfast meals with no breakfast, there was no significant difference in any of these 13 subscales that we assessed. I saw you. Okay, make sure you got it. Okay, so let's talk about the limitations and confounders to the study. In spite of the advantages of the study design we employed, there's some inherent limitations and potential confounders remain. As with any self-report measures, there is the issue of sensitivity and specificity of the measures which were used and whether the measures were sensitive enough to detect short-term effects. Studies have shown that habitual breakfast consumption was related to academic performance, and thus short-term effects may not be easily detected. It is also important to note that the sample size was determined based on an effect size of 1.5 units, an arbitrary number, and that the sample consisted of healthy children, which may also have limited any significant beneficial findings from breakfast consumption. And finally, the 2 breakfast meals, waffle and hazelnut spread, were isocaloric with similar macronutrient composition. I think if we were to look at whether or not macronutrient composition affects breakfast, and it may come out in the next speaker's presentation when she discusses insulin and glucose, but that was not the intent of the study. It would require a whole new other study. Moreover, since we saw no effect in the 13 subscales for neuropsychological functioning, we saw no effect of insulin or glucose as a result of consuming breakfast. Now, There are some strengths to the study, despite the limitations. The strengths of the study include this is a large sample size considering it's a clinical, randomized, repeated measures. Repeated measures, by the way, is one of the best designs to conduct a clinical study. And we had a diverse sample size. We had stringent exclusionary criteria, stringent to the point that it was almost impossible to get our final sample. We did use standardized, validated neuropsychological measures which has normative values for this test population. It was conducted in a highly controlled environmental and nutritional conditions. And we did assess selective biomarkers. So I think in conclusion, I want to show this figure that has been published, showing that more studies are needed regarding habitual breakfast consumption and its effect on neuropsychological functioning in healthy children and those with marginal or subnormal nutritional status. And also looking at other different parameters, looking at macronutrient composition, and then for people out there that believe in the glycemic index, you can also look at high versus low glycemic index, calories, and so there's a lot involved of looking at different components of breakfast on cognitive processes. So the secret is to swallow without chewing. That sends big chunks of food into your bloodstream. This forces your arteries to open wider, which increases blood flow to the brain, which makes you smarter and more successful. So I'd like to just disclose my funding and support. Partial support was received from the USDA ARS through a specific cooperative agreement, and partial support was also received from Ferrero USA, and that's why there was a hazelnut breakfast. Now, they were quite surprised with the results of the study. So with that, I'd like to say thank you, and I'm open for some questions.
Thank you, Dr. Nicklas. We still have ample time for questions and comments. Dr. Salvador, and then Dr. Andrew, and then Dr. Sophie.
It's a very naive question, but repeating all the battery of tests, don't you have some sort of skew there on the repeated measurements of the tests particularly?
Skewed in the sense
in the sense of learning the tests, for the obese kids, we could only repeat them twice. A knapsack questionnaire, you seen it?
I understand what you're trying to get at.
Yeah.
You're trying to get at the practice effects. We tried to minimize that, and we tried to follow what is the best protocol. That's why the sequencing was very important. We did separate the tests by 6 days, and we stood by that. It was no less than 6 days. But surely there could be a practice effect. But you would, if you look at the distribution, it's not highly skewed to the right, is what you're suggesting. But we did look at the distribution, and it wasn't skewed to the right. Good question.
Good morning. I'm Dr. Andrew from the Philippines. You presented a very interesting study wherein both the breakfast skippers and those who are taking breakfast did not exhibit any significant cognitive difference in the test, right?
Yes.
So my question is, there is an increasing trend or focus right now, particularly in social media, with regards to intermittent fasting, and a lot of claims, mostly anecdotal, claiming that there are also cognitive positive implications to intermittent fasting, but mostly done on animal studies. What is your take on this? regarding the medical implications and positive outcomes of intermittent fasting, which is partly related also to the breakfast skipping, saying that they also improve in a way the cognitive functions which are done mostly on the animals.
Well, I don't like to extrapolate animal findings to findings that we see in children, first of all. I'll put that caveat on the table. That's my personal
Yeah.
bias. As far as I can't explain the results as well as my colleague that will be coming up next when it comes to some of the metabolic pathways with regard to glucose and insulin. So I'd like to put that on her plate. I see that she stepped out, but I will make sure that she gets that question.
Yeah, it's okay. Thank you. We'll wait for it.
So I was here.
Oh,
I
okay.
was very curious to listen to the results of this last study, and because my son likes to have crepe with hazelnut spread for breakfast, so now I know that it's not so bad. But I have one question because sometimes he likes to have a breakfast and sometimes he doesn't. So my question really points to the fact of what does regularity in eating breakfast matters? Because those who skip breakfast, okay, we saw the results and what the impact on their overall diet, but what about individual variability in whether they have breakfast sometimes and they don't have breakfast sometimes? So would that matter? Would that impact their cognitive outcomes? Because I assume that we adapt also to, and we learn about meal patterns, and so what would be the impact?
This is another one for Sandra. Sandra, we have two questions for you. There's another one on regular breakfast consumption versus irregular breakfast consumption versus habitual. It depends upon who you talk to. I know Marion Nessel in New York swears that she never eats breakfast and she's fine. And she makes up for it in other meal periods throughout the day. But as far as what I know of the literature, most of the people have looked at habitual breakfast consumption versus chronic skipping, and nothing in between that.
I think what we should do really is control for children who are habitual breakfast consumers and those who are not. Because like you said, we'll probably find differences in the susceptibility to be affected by different breakfast interventions, whether you're a child who regularly eats breakfast or not.
Okay, can you repeat your question since we have?
Maybe before we go to the question of Professor Gibney, Andrew, can you repeat your question for Dr. Sandra?
Well, actually, right now, there is an increasing interest in intermittent fasting with regards to its metabolic implications, saying that they have seen an increase in cognitive performance even in patients with Alzheimer's to those who are doing intermittent fasting. So I was just asking a while ago, what is Professor Nicklas' take on intermittent fasting, if it's a bit similar also to the breakfast skipping, because in your study there is not much significant differences observed in those children who are taking breakfast as compared to those who are skipping breakfast. No, taking breakfast and skipping breakfast, yeah.
Okay, that's a very good question. I think we have to distinguish here between children and adults. So I fully agree that there's quite a lot of data to suggest that the intermittent fasting, and this fasting can be just the overnight fast, is actually beneficial in terms of the general metabolic profile, in terms of the propensity for insulin resistance and so on. I don't think there are any studies at the moment that show acute effects of that intermittent fast, but for the long-term health, that seems to be beneficial. Children have quite a different metabolic makeup in the sense that their needs in the morning might be higher than those from an adult. I will actually talk in I will talk about this in my talk in terms of the counter-regulation we find. But again, I think we need to take into consideration that this intermittent fasting, if we just talk about the sleep period, might also be quite important in children, and it's particularly important in children when we talk about the obesity problems we have. So if a child has a late night snack and doesn't want to have breakfast in the morning, then this might actually not be a bad idea, because what they're naturally doing is they're implementing this optimal fasting period for the body.
Yeah, the issue of breakfast skipping, it's very important, but the problem is that the numbers of people affected by breakfast skipping depends on the type of survey that looks at this. So if you do a 24-hour recall, it's going to be high. If, as in most European countries, it goes a little bit beyond that, say a 4-day study, we find that less than 10% of children have no breakfast ever. And so how big an issue do you really think is breakfast skipping on a public health nutrition basis?
Well, I think your point is well taken, that most of your national surveys are 124-hour recall, which may grossly overestimate breakfast skipping. And so I don't think we have a handle on multiple 24-hour recalls. At the very least, we may have a food frequency where they will ask one question on the average, how often do you eat breakfast? And you know how reliable a food frequency questionnaire with one question is. So I would have to add that to research gaps. We really don't fully understand what percentage of children are skipping breakfast based on our current methodology that we're using, and more studies are needed to characterize that.
Any more questions? What is your take regarding certain observations that skipping breakfast can lead to binge eating during lunch and its potential effect on body weight?
That's actually on my to-do list. I want to look at what happens if you skip breakfast or if you have a breakfast on subsequent intake. Now, old studies from NHANES show that you don't make up the nutrient inadequacies or the lower nutrient intakes if you skip breakfast at other meal periods throughout the day, but they may have changed over time. And I think we need to look at that with the most recent NHANES data. The other thing which I'm going to share with you that's important, and it's on another one on my to-do list, they're going towards mandatory school breakfast in some of the schools in the United States. Or they're going with not only mandatory for all children, but also if you have a certain reduced and paid price population in that school, they will get school breakfast mostly in the classroom. So my question is, what happens with the child that has two breakfasts? There's a big concern about that. The child has breakfast at home, and then they go to school where it's mandatory, and they're given a second breakfast. So how does that affect other meal periods throughout the day? How does that affect plate waste? Is it a cost-effective mandatory standard that's required in the United States? So this is a whole new area of research that we need to look at with regard to this mandatory breakfast in schools.
Perhaps a question on the methodology. Why did you have so many exclusive criteria? And then would it not actually bias the results because you don't have any more natural, subject group?
Okay, that's a limitation. This the results cannot be generalized to the natural environment.
Yeah.
But the neuropsychologist that worked with us was very adamant, and that's her field. I mean, exclusionary criteria went all the way back to pregnancy and also what happened with delivery. If there was any certain conditions that happened during pregnancy and delivery, because they use that in their clinical practice because it affects the neuropsychological tests that are being used.
Okay.
So that's why our criteria was stringent, because any change in results, we don't know if it's because of prior conditions that can cause changes in the results. And moreover, the intent was to do this in a highly controlled setting, which cannot be generalized to the natural environment.
Yeah.
Yes, good point.
The last three questions from the audience, and then Dr. Danton, an additional from Dr. Salvador, and then Dr. Hardincia. But this is just a short question. How about brunch for the breakfast skippers?
That's a good question. I think I had it in my talk. I mean, we got brunch, we got continental breakfast, we got the French breakfast. I mean, there must be at least 10 names of breakfasts. And so I think in my concluding remarks, how do you define a breakfast? And I don't know if the sample size is high enough consuming brunch in children. I mean, brunch typically in the United States is consumed on Sundays. It's a big thing to go out on Sundays and have a brunch. But it's, I doubt the numbers are very small in Haynes to look at the question with regard to brunch. But I think in the type of breakfast in different countries have different names. And I think certainly if you have large enough sample sizes, I would look at the effect of that type of breakfast on total nutrient intake and what that type of breakfast provides as well.
Yeah, so it's a very interesting study. In reality, most of the children actually, they don't habitually escape breakfast most of the time, but they are escape occasionally. And to address this type of phenomena, in your study, you have three arms. Two with breakfast, another is breakfast escaping. So have you ever done some crossover design? Let's say one day you have breakfast, another you don't, and you see the difference?
If I understand your question specifically, I think what you're looking at will be a totally different research design altogether. I think if I were to put it as a question would be, where is the inflection point of a decrease in cognitive processes, depending upon the timing of breakfast, may it be regular, intermittent, or habitual. So where is the inflection point where the cognitive processes, you see a dramatic fall in those testing?
I mean, in a crossover, in a crossover design, if you have, for example, provide this child one day with breakfast and the second day without breakfast, and if you do the test in both days, you may have some differences, and then maybe can address this type of questions. So if the children actually skip breakfast occasionally, what does it mean? What is the impact on their cognitive?
Okay, I think this goes along the lines of the practice effects as a result of the testing that you asked, Salvador, I think it was you. But also, I mean, we decided not to have the sequencing in fixed order. And the reason for that is we want to minimize any noise that can occur from the fixed order of the meals as opposed to the practice effects that can occur with the interviewers. But you bring up an important point.
Yeah, thank you very much. First about the comment on brunch, yeah. For me and for us as consensus among the nutritional professional in Indonesia, brunch, we call it as morning snack. It can be breakfast, but it's not healthy breakfast. Because healthy breakfast must divide is not only about the nutrient content, but also about the time for doing the breakfast. The second one about my comment also on intermittent fasting related to religion, especially for the Muslim. Intermittent fasting and can be also twice a week, like Monday and Thursday, strongly suggest to have an early morning breakfast before sunset. So everybody in Muslim doing intermittent fasting should be has a breakfast in the early morning before sunrise. Before sunrise, I mean. That's a comment, and it's not suggest for the children under 6 or 7 years old. So it is the kind of religion just to comment, not a kind of science, but it seems to me the science later on will prove like that. And my question is about any data on fluid intake properly measured in this study, because in other clinical study last 3 or 4 years ago showed that the dehydration, low body water, that also related to the decrease the cognitive function. Thank you very much.
That's an interesting question on dehydration. I would think one would also want to look at that. I'd say at least our healthy kids were hydrated quite good. They always had water when they were in the metabolic unit. But I think for future research, that's a good question one should examine. And as far as good breakfast or healthy, whatever those words mean, I mean, they're ambiguous to me. I will address them in my concluding presentation.
One short question, the last, from Dr. Salvador.
It's not short.
Please make it short.
The thing is that I also believe it's something that it has to do with hydration in the breakfast skippers, and also with the ketones. You measured ketones, and we didn't see that those results, and I think that's an important point. And I truly believe it's not much of a public health problem, but yeah, in a daily basis, it could be related also to a lot of BMI. And my question was mainly directed to those 2 items I'm still curious about. Those 2 items that were significant. What were they related to?
What items?
In the tests, the 13 items, there were 2 that were significant with a 0.04 or something like that.
No. If you look at multiple comparisons using a Bonferroni correction, they were not significant. I mean, you're sort of stretching the data there.
Yeah, I want to do
Yeah,
it.
I know you want to.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nicklas, and for those who asked their very good questions, thank you.